Chapter 27, July 1944. The June heat of 1944 shimmered off the hood of the Mercedes as it roared through the Saxon countryside. Josephine sat in the passenger seat, glancing at the countryside as it flitted past. A glance to her left, the pistol stole out of her brother's desk at Runfunkhaus in her pocket, the money she had also found. Josephine took all she could carry. She did not intend to be in William Joyce's company ever again. The driver, a Hauptmann, scanned the pass she had forged and had been professional. That was, until they crossed the bridge toward Halle. Josephine caught the shift in his peripheral vision, settling his hand towards his hip. He adjusted his weight, shifted his holster forward, and his eyes began to flick incessantly between her hands and the road. Then, there was the click of the safety catch. In the quiet hum of the car, the metallic snick was as loud as a gunshot to her trained ears. He knew the orders had changed. There was green grass and fields just on the border of Halle town. Josephine flung open the door, not waiting until the barrel of the gun had emerged. The driver swept the Mercedes around a fast bend. That was it. The momentum was enough for her to keep on moving, jamming her left heel onto the driver's brake, sending the heavy car into a screaming, uncontrolled skid. The captain's hands flew to the wheel to keep the car from flipping. She slammed her palm into his jaw, snapping his head back, before rolling across the grass while the car and its driver sped on. Beyond her, the Mercedes swerved wildly, tires shrieking against the cobblestones of Halle outskirts, before slamming into a stone wall with a sickening crunch. Josephine didn't stay to watch. She rolled, absorbed the impact, and was on her feet in a blur of motion. She was in the heart of Halle, wide roads embracing a series of narrow alleys and timbered shadows. To her east lay Leipzig, and Milo. Josephine spent the next 6 hours avoiding the main roads as she headed there, scaling garden walls and wading through the icy waters of the Freiburger Mulde to throw off any hounds. If only she didn't need O'Reilly. Then she could follow this tributary all the way to Colditz. But she did. Josephine needed O'Reilly to fix the signals, send false traffic of her own fictitious actions, to really cause trouble. It gradually grew dark, a slow, summer's night where birds took their time to tweet their night songs. Josephine began to climb a small ridge and then down towards the city. Bomb damage came into view, and she remembered the Lancasters, a quad of Merlin engines, thrumming their cargo of incendiaries and depositing them all over the city. Street. Thomas's stood proud against the waxing moon. Waxing. Josephine remembered her teacher telling her, when he had come to give her German lessons, meant to grow like her waxing adults. So the moon was in its growing phase, betraying the bomb damage done to the tower of the cathedral. And in she went, for there was nowhere else Josephine could think of waiting for John Francis O'Reilly, apart from where she had seen him last. 88,888,888. In the bombed-out tower of Street Thomas's, Milo, the triple agent, otherwise known as John Francis O'Reilly, sat hunched over his transmitter. He knew William Joyce had tried to bury Josephine in scandal. The British would now be stricken her name from their books. She would have nowhere else to come to but to find him, and so he waited for Josephine at the top of the bell tower. Time to anticipate a feint that she would want to be made and so to signal to her his definitive location. Milo made his play, his voice cutting through the European static with an authority that outwitted Haw-Haw's sneer. From the chapel below, Josephine heard the voice she knew over a loudspeaker, and closed her eyes. A prayer, yes, to the God she loved, but a prayer, too, that she would find O'Reilly. Germany calling a broken bar. O'Reilly echoed Haw-Haw, but used his own County Clare accent. This is the voice of the true resistance. Hear me, Colditz. Hear me, London. The woman Josephine is no traitor. She is the sister of Paddy Mayne, the Irish Lion of the Saz. Josephine Mayne is the ghost who survived Natzweiler and Gaggenau when her comrades were fed to the night and fog. She has walked through the fires of the Reich not to serve it, but to dismantle it. If she reaches your gates, you do not bar her. Instead, kneel inside the castle, The broadcast hissed through the hidden radio in the chapel loft, which had been hastily wired up by Charles Collins to route into the main loudspeaker system. All in that flag went deathly silent. 88,888,888. July to November 1944, Leipzig. And so O'Reilly and Josephine met by Bach's tomb, purporting to be tourists who had, as friends, independently met one another by chance. They had dodged through resistance houses and hidden places in the city, re-emerging every so often so that O'Reilly could transmit, the cathedral, at the library of the university where Josephine had gone when her leg had been crushed. July's humidity gave way to damp August, which had continued damp and had become considerably colder as the weeks went by. "Keep it near you," O'Reilly urged, after giving her a short dagger. "We are using so many places that the chances of betrayal are high. Cut and run, should you need to." He had glanced at the blade, literally, if necessary. Josephine smiled, which turned into a genuine grin at the joke. The first time she felt she wanted to laugh. Autumn encircled them, an enleaved mantle holding soot and moisture and the scepter of wind close to them. So Josephine, moving through the skeletal remains of the city with the practiced invisibility of an Suraith, found her sanctuaries between games beneath shadows, Morsky hammering out her next untruth, a tapestry of grand strategic deceptions. Josephine found a perverse, chilling thrill facility in tailoring these falsehoods for her half-brother, William Joyce. She infused her coded dispatches with the intimate cadences of their shared childhood, weaponizing to good effect their domestic history, emphasizing his drug and alcohol and libidinous desires. In a Germany looking to natural health, this would have been highly embarrassing, under a bitter cover of false allied movements. However, the delicate equilibrium of their deception was shattered in a shivering November midnight when the mundane reality of a near miss stripped away the protective veneer of her anonymity. The sudden, rhythmic hammering of jackboots against the cobblestones outside their latest refuge, followed by the blinding, intrusive sweep of a Gestapo searchlight across the peeling wallpaper, served as a violent reminder that the Reich's patience was as exhausted as its resources. Escaping through a skylight with the cold rain stinging her face and the shouts of the Schutzpolizei echoing in the alleyway below, Josephine realized with a sudden clarity that the time for subtle radio games had passed, superseded by a more primitive and visceral compulsion. The catalyst for her departure was a single, crumpled slip of intelligence that O'Reilly had retrieved from a dead drop. A confirmation that David Sterling was still being held within the walls of Colditz Castle. That he was still the catalyzed Josephine's decision, born of commitment to Bill, a challenge to Sterling's reckless bravado, no doubt showing off as more and more prisoners went for a run, and the profound, aching love that Josephine refused to acknowledge. She felt, buried deep under her professionalism. He may be dead any day, should he cross the SS guards, Josephine considered, bedding down in a damp hayloft in the east of the city. She had delayed too long. She needed to move. She closed her eyes, and her mind drifted to Bill, and Paddy and the rest of the SAS, somewhere in France, although perhaps even in Germany now. And to Henry, with the Prince, and Barkworth and Franks. How she would be with them, were she not here. She told Milo that night, who promised to wait 2 days before he radioed Charlie Collins, and wished her luck, followed by a brief, fraternal embrace, a move unthinkable 18 months before. Indeed, a lot had happened in those 18 months. With the pistol O'Reilly had given to Josephine, she began her trek through the thickening November mist toward the fortress on the cliff. The 30 miles between the ruins of Leipzig and the grim towers of Colditz contained several checkpoints. Yet she moved with a purpose that made her bold, with senses heightened to avoid each one, and, at last, came to the Mulder, whose sinewy contours she remembered well. 88,888,888. The castle of Colditz loomed through the swirling November fog like a prehistoric beast carved from the rock. Josephine, crouching in the sodden undergrowth of the valley, watched the rhythmic sweep of the searchlights across the outer bale, her so-trained mind rejecting the suicidal folly of an ascent in favor of a more insidious, Trojan subversion. But she would never have thought of, damp, and hungry. She gained access in a reverse progress into the French Quarter where, by chance, she saw a consignment of Red Cross parcels. Who was filling them now? She wondered, and a fancy took Josephine to look at the labels. They were full, packed with goods and treats for the prisoners, cheap tobacco, shaving kits, pens, combs, games and food. One box had hardly anything in it, and was marked to Captain Pat Reed from a Mr. Gordon Bennett. Josephine laughed, trying not to laugh out loud. With the practiced economy of a woman who had already squashed herself into dozens of tiny spaces in Leipzig, Josephine packed herself into the reinforced crate that contained woolen socks and a blanket, and waited. The journey into the post room was full of jolts and bumps. At least twice the box was dropped with so much force that Josephine thought she would be flung right out of it. When the crate was finally heaved from the truck bed and slammed onto the wooden floor of the parcel office, the sudden cessation of movement was followed by the sharp, authoritative snick of a guard's blade slicing through the heavy twine. As the lid was pried upward, Josephine did not wait to be discovered. Instead, before the guards could react, she pulled the pistol and held it in both hands, before pushing open the lid and bounding past them. "Cats!" she heard one guard exclaim. "Fuchs!" cried the other. Josephine got to the top of the stairs of the post room, then slid behind some almost permanent temporary boarding, that led to a passageway to the French officers' quarters. She had achieved the impossible, an escape, rather than the other way around, penetrating the most secure flag the Reich possessed. Josephine took a steadying breath, the air of cold tasting of stone and ancient confinement, and prepared to navigate the final, most treacherous part of her journey, across the rooftop to the British Quarter. A distant bell chimed 12 midnight. 2 more hours before she risked the distance, when the guards changed. She was close to Sterling, close to getting him out. If the stubborn man allowed her to liberate him from the unescapable prison. 88,888,888. The labyrinthine interior of the French Quarter filled Josephine's senses like rotten greenery. A sour, organic smell was emanating from a passage, and the walls were streaming with water. Yet she climbed up, and had managed to get onto the roof. As expected, the lights dimmed. Boots on the cobbles below indicated that there was a change in guard. Above her, the rope that dangled permanently down the French officer's wall. A climb. One which made her legs tired and her torso ache, but she managed it in quick jumps and starts until she was on the building's roof opposite, but not quite level with the chapel's loft. Broken and decaying, the Kolditz-Koch was still in the shadow of one open archway window, its nose and wing illuminated by the moon. She had to get up on the outside, Josephine knew, and had about 6 minutes to do it. Down had been infinitely easier, and she was going to have to attempt to scale the wall using the uneven, broken masonry. Just then, a light came on, its searching beam arraying the castle's roofs. Damn. They had changed the time of the watch. Or, they had kept the 2 guards in place while the change was taking place. She pressed herself flat on the roof, and looked around, and saw an alternative. If she were to go down the other side of the building and into the ditch at the bottom, she could approach the chapel from another angle, climbing straight to the top. It was risky, and one false move meant a 30 bar 50-foot drop, which would likely kill her. A shot rang out, from a different angle. Perhaps someone was having a similar thought, although their egress would be to leave the castle. There was only one way. Josephine dropped down, but didn't have to go as far as she thought. The laundry window was ajar, and her mind wandered to the luxury of bathing in the hot water, piqued especially since strip washes and a few dips in the river had been all she had managed to come by recently. She looked up, and began to climb. Halfway up, and a searchlight was combing the air around her. Over to the other side of the courtyard, more were fixed on a scramble and dashes across the tiles. Eggers was still in charge here, so likely still allowing fair game. Shouts came and cheering, as some group or other bid for freedom. She was almost at the top when gunfire made her freeze. A bullet whizzed past Josephine's ear, another grazing her right knuckle. She clung on with her left, and swung pendulously as another volley came her way. Eggers clearly had not decided to continue his policy of fair game. Josephine scrabbled with her now bleeding right hand for a hold, and then used her feet to get more grip against the ancient stone wall. Noises above her in the chapel loft and blunt roars indicated she had been spotted. But were they supportive or noises of condemnation? Scrabbling a little higher, Josephine made to reach the sill of an open window archway. The masonry gave way, and gravity took effect. Josephine, a roar above her made her look up in her descent. Then a hand clamped over her wrist and another over her other. Bate Reed and Charles Collins pulled her up and inside. 88,888,888. We saw you coming across the frog's roof, Reed told Josephine as they stood by Collins' radio. And then Milo got in contact. We knew it would be you. What's with the bullets? Josephine asked. You'd think they'd be pleased with the enemy breaking into the prison. Both men laughed, and Charlie draped a blanket around her shoulders. You've come for Major Sterling, then? Reed asked, handing her a glass of water. A lot of the water was distillate, from the still below, Josephine guessed, and the shock of it made her choke. We heard about your exploits via Milo, Reed continued when she didn't answer. Did you really do all of those things? Question is, Captain, do you think I did? Pat Reed pondered Josephine's question, and narrowed his eyes. I would believe them, of you, he laughed. More importantly, so would most of the Reich. You must have annoyed Joyce with all of these exploits all over his airwaves. Josephine sighed. How good it was to be in the company of friends again. But she was also in Colditz Castle prison camp, and a social visit was not what she was there for. I need to move fast, as long as the bugger will come with me, Josephine added. He's in the solitary cell. Eggers has had enough of his black market trading. Josephine smiled, and stepped lightly to the radio. Behind a panel was a key, one which opened all locks in the castle, and held it out to Reed. The Germans didn't think such a master key could ever be made and used by the enemy. I'll break him out a broken bar. She sighed heavily from the exertion, and then take it, Captain Reed. Get everyone out. The captain looked at Josephine as if she had just handed him the key to heaven, so to speak. He leaned towards her and kissed her forehead before frowning. And I only get to hear about this now? Josephine looked sheepish. I forgot, until just now, Josephine told him, which, for once, was the truth. We found your escape devices, Reed continued. At least we guessed it was you, Swallow. Josephine nodded at the pseudonym, and glanced to Collins, who nodded, abashed. She had confided this to him one night after Sterling's betrayal of her identity, and a vague part of her had hoped that it would be her friend who found it. With these gadgets, and I must say, excellent, please inform MI9, and the key, you have made it possible for us to away. Reed kissed her on the cheek in a fatherly kind of way, then took her hands in his. Go and get the bugger out, and don't let him mess you around. Good luck, Josephine, Charlie Collins called as she strode to the trapdoor that separated the chapel loft from the stairs to the German ISIS quarters. She turned back, and flung herself into his arms. You too, Charlie, she whispered by his ear. Get out and get home safely. 88,888,888. The heavy, iron-studded door of the solitary cell creaked with reluctance as she assaulted it with her key. It opened part of the way, and she slipped through the gap as silently as she could. Josephine's eye drew to the bed, where she had allowed herself to be taken by him as a result of the drunken game they had played, and, later, when she thought they were to die. Instead, however, the bed was empty. David Sterling stood by the wall adjacent the courtyard. No windows in the solitary cell, but somehow Josephine felt he was tracking the lively activities still going on outside. So, when he saw Josephine O'Neill standing in front of him, he tried, and failed, to hide his expression of shock. She folded her arms and waited for the caustic retort, which wasn't long in coming, and braced herself to meet his sharp tongue. Good God, Josephine, he breathed, balling his fists and placing them on his hips. I'd heard the Red Cross was improving their service, but I didn't expect them to start delivering vengeful angels in packing crates. Josephine's mouth curled into a thin, scalingly precise line of derision. "You look appalling," she told him. "And I, in fact, did smuggle myself in that way." She stepped closer, the silenced pistol still gripped in hand. "Collins is upstairs playing at Radio Gods with O'Reilly in Leipzig, risking a slow death to keep the hounds off our scent while you've been sitting here, no doubt composing your memoirs. You always were better at the grand gesture than the gritty reality of actually staying out of a cage, weren't you? It's almost as if you packed those parcels yourself." "The loot was good." "Then I hope you didn't barter away all the loot." "I packed," Josephine chided. "Yes, I did pack them. I became coordinator, in fact, and was rewarded." As Sterling began to open his mouth, Sterling moved to speak again, but Josephine cut him off with a sharp, dismissive gesture. "Save it. Save every drop of that effortless charisma for the centuries we'll have to butcher on the way out. I find it remarkably tedious when there's work to be done." Yet, even as the scorn poured from her with the practiced ease of a defense mechanism, a treacherous, visceral heat bloomed in the center of her chest, a realization that hit her with more force than the leap from the car she had made in Halle. Josephine looked at the hollows beneath his eyes and the stubborn, unbreakable set of his jaw, and realized her sharp callousness was, in fact, something else. Her hand moved to her lower stomach for a moment before clutching the pistol in both hands. She loathed his legend, which he would be proud and boastful of, and she loved him with a searing ferocity. "You really are a monumental idiot, David," she whispered, the caustic edge finally faltering, her words uneven and raw, and gestured towards the broken door. "Now, move. If we're caught because you were busy admiring the moonlight, I'll shoot you myself and save the Gestapo the paperwork." 88,888,888. The descent into the upper reaches of the castle, leading Sterling back to the flickering candlelight of Collins's radio hole, where the air was thick with the smell of scorched wire. Charlie looked up, expectantly. She turned her gaze toward the mountain of Red Cross parcels Sterling had meticulously stashed over the preceding months, all of which Reed and Collins had raided, and worked out Josephine had instigated most of them herself, what with the sketches of the interior of Colditz meticulously plotted. "Listen closely, Collins, because I won't repeat this once the sirens begin," Josephine told her friend, pressing the universal key into her friend's hand, then waved a hand at the maps. "Take these to the escape committee, to Howe and Reed." At her words, Lieutenant Collins seized the maps and, with a smile of fraternal affection, disappeared down the steps. Josephine stood on the trapdoor, then slid the bolt across with her foot. She turned back to Sterling, her eyes narrowing, masking the terrifying depth of her affection. "While you and I vanish into the mist, the rest of the castle will be making their own exits. It's a mess, it's theatrical, and it's exactly the kind of chaos you thrive on." Despite her biting words, she reached out, her hand lingering for a fraction of a second too long on the rough wool of Sterling's sleeve, a possessive, protective gesture that she immediately retracted with a scowl. "Come on. We are getting out of here." 88,888,888. David stopped dead when he saw her expression and looked at her, and the bravado he had used to condemn her in the courtyard evaporated. In that moment of suspended time, David didn't see a turncoat. He saw the woman he had doubted had been at Ear House standing in front of him, no doubt having been back with Soane with his brother. He remembered the last time they had been truly together. That desperate, feverish night under the shadow of execution. They had been trapped, the threat of the firing squad looming at dawn, and they had clung to each other with a raw, savage intimacy that had bypassed rank and reason. He remembered the heat of her skin against the cold certainty of death, and the way he had used his body to drown out his own fear. Sterling realized, with a sickening jolt of clarity, that every word she had ever said, every warning about the Funkspiel, every plea for the 31, had been the absolute, shivering truth. "Josephine," he breathed, the pistol wavering in her grip. "The radio wasn't a confession, David," she said, her voice steady despite her chattering teeth. She held out the Red Cross sewing kit, the silk maps spilling out like entrails. "Milo has cleared the way. I broke back in to finish it." Sterling looked at the Red Cross goods, then back to Josephine's eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered, a word he had never truly uttered in his life. "Don't be sorry," she snapped, turning toward the cellar hatch. "Be fast. The river is waiting, and I've already promised Bill I'd bring you home." But they didn't move immediately. Desire, stronger than any will, stirred within both Sterling and Josephine. The shadows of the Colditz Chapel loft were long and interspersed with the lights from Colin's dormant radio. It was David Sterling who stepped first. The words of Milo's broadcast, the truth of her sacrifice and the blood of her lineage were still vibrating in the air. He looked at her, and the arrogant man who had slandered her in the courtyard vanished, replaced by the man who had once sought refuge in her arms when the world seemed at its end. Sterling reached out, his large hands cupping her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw with a sudden, bruising intensity. He didn't ask for forgiveness, he claimed it. He pulled her into him, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that tasted of river silt, salt, and a desperate, rediscovered fire. The war paused as Sterling's hands wandered over her woolen top, his fingers trembling with a hunger that bypassed rank and reason. With a low, guttural groan, he pulled the fabric over her head, bearing her to the freezing air of the chapel. Her skin was pebbled with cold, but her nipples were as large and pert as he remembered them, reacting instantly to the bite of the air and the heat of his gaze. He leaned down, his mouth hot and demanding as he took one peek between his lips, sucking deeply while his teeth grazed the sensitive, swollen bud. Josephine let out a jagged, broken gasp, her fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. Her own hands were already busy, fumbling with the heavy fabric of his trousers. She found him stone hard, a thick, pulsing weight that strained against her palm. All memory of caution now absent from her mind. All memory of him flashed through her, the sensation of his huge cock inside her tight cunt, a fullness so absolute she had once thought she would break under the force of it. Her body, so recently recovered from the trauma of the miscarriage, screamed for reaffirmation, for the blunt, driving reality of him to fill the emptiness left by the Highland winter. Josephine dropped to her knees on the cold stone, her fingers guiding him out of his clothes. She took him into her mouth, her tongue teasing Sterling's broad, velvet bell until she tasted the sharp, salty tang of his precum. Sterling's breath caught in his throat, a harsh sound in the hollow chapel. As he felt her throat wrap around him, he reached down, his fingers tangling in her damp hair to pull Josephine to his pace, then pulled her up by the shoulders to back to her feet. Sterling pressed her back against a cold stone pillar, his hand sliding between her thighs. She was already slick, dripping with a desire that made his hand slip against her skin. He adjusted his grip, using the ball of his hand to rotate with heavy, rhythmic pressure against her clitoris, while his other hand moved up to knead her breasts. He caught her nipples between his thumb and forefinger, pinching and rolling them until Josephine's head leaned back against the masonry, her whimpers echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Sterling's hand traced Josephine's stomach, a broken bar, and felt a broken bar, a scar, a broken bar which hadn't been the last time he had taken her. He lifted her then, her legs wrapping instinctively around his waist, her ankles crossing behind his firm buttocks to lock him in. As he guided his massive length into her, Josephine felt that familiar, stretching burn, the sheer size of him claiming every inch of her. She sat on him, riding him there in the shadow of the radio, her body moving in a frantic, sliding rhythm. Sterling held her steady by her hips, his thrusts powerful and deep. One of his hands stayed locked on her waist, while the other returned to her chest, his fingers punishing her pert nipples in turn, keeping her at the very edge of madness. The friction of his cock and the sharp pinch of his fingers pushed her over. Josephine came violently, a shivering, internal collapse that drew a low growl from his throat. He didn't let her down. He continued to drive into her, his movements becoming more animalistic as he neared his own release. He felt her second orgasm begin to rack her just as he finally spilled into her, a heavy, hot flood that seemed to bind them together in the dark. For a minute, they stayed locked together, their breath coming in ragged, white blooms. Josephine leaned her forehead against his neck, whimpering softly from the sheer effort of desiring him, of finally having him back, and rode another set of orgasms out of Sterling's pubic bone. Then, Sterling's grip slackened. The heat of the moment began to cool into something sharper and more clinical. He pulled back. His eyes no longer clouded with her, but focused on the darkness of the exit, pulling his spent cock into his trousers, wetly, and watched Josephine's breasts and nipples become hidden behind her tunic. "I'm not going back to the Highlands, Joe," he whispered, his voice dry. Josephine's heart plummeted. "I came here for you. Bill is waiting." He took the gun from her hands, his fingers lingering on hers for one final, elective second before he stepped away. "Tell Bill you did it, and I'm out. But I have unfinished business." He looked toward the loft hatch, a cold, reckless light in his eyes. "Eve Mansour is alive. I've heard she's in the south, and I'm going to find her." At that poisonous name Josephine, already a little unsteady on her feet, staggered back. Eve Mansour, the woman who had betrayed the British in the most cruel way, Broken Bar, who had cost Josephine her peace and almost her life. To hear Sterling, who had just fucked her with such an overreaching passion, had chosen that ghost over the woman who had just broken into hell to save him, was a betrayal that cut deeper than any blade. "You're going to find her?" Josephine gasped, her voice trembling. "After this, after what she did?" "She's a debt I haven't settled, Joe," he said, already backing toward the shadows, the old, arrogant mask of the SAS commander sliding back into place. "You're a Broken Bar, a pleasure, a Broken Bar, but, well, you know a Broken Bar, she's a Broken Bar.